All right. Good evening and welcome. My name is Pat Kowitzel, and I am the author the buyer and author program coordinator at Magic City Books in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for another in our virtual author program series. We've been doing this for 10 months now. We started in near the end of April, doing virtual author programs, 2 a week, and now we're up to 3 a week, pretty much every week. This is we're well past our century mark now of virtual author programs, and so no real end in sight with this. Hopefully, the vaccine continues to roll out here in Oklahoma. We're able to start getting teachers vaccinated, and we're excited about that. But we're still quite a ways away from everyone being able to have access to the vaccine. So we'll be doing online programs for a long time. And if this is your very first Magic City Books virtual event, welcome. We have a full schedule of programs booked through April into May now on our website. We add more all the time. So check out magiccitybooks.com for that. We're going to be posting in the chat tonight with links to purchase our featured book, Hades, Argentina, and some other information in the chat. So as those kind of come through, you'll be able to see that. And if you have questions tonight, utilize that Q&A feature, and we'll be able to get your question asked and answered as time allows. If you're joining us on Facebook, just question in the comments there, and I'll get those moved over to our moderator to ask. We are, in a position with virtual events where we're able to bring people together that we might not have had under other circumstances, and especially pairings between author and moderator. And that's certainly true tonight. Our featured author tonight, Daniel Loedel, is a debut novelist. His book, Hades, Argentina, came out a few weeks ago. And right around the time it came out, our good friend, Rabbi Fitzgerman from Congregation B'nai Amunah, let us know that he actually had an inside track with Daniel, and that his daughter and Daniel were good friends, and that we should try and be able to put something together. And so within about a week from that time, we were able to book this event for tonight. And so we're really excited to be able to do that and not have to, worry about flights or hotel rooms or anything else like that, just be able to have a good conversation. And then as we booked Daniel, we needed to book somebody for him to talk to for our evening. And that's where our moderator, Michael Zapata, came in. And Michael's book, the Lost Book of Adana, Moreau, won a lot of awards and was on a lot of best of lists when it came out, and it is a real pleasure to read. And we're going to have links for that book as well in our chat, so you can pick up both books tonight. As Jeff Martin, our co-founder, always says, we're running a special tonight, 2 books for the price of 2. All sales, of course, benefit the Tulsa Literary Coalition, the nonprofit that owns and operates Magic City Books and helps us to continue to present wonderful author programs like this to our community. So check out our schedule, buy books, buy often, read often, and enjoy this evening with Michael and Daniel. I'm going to hand it over to them now, and have a great event, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for coming in tonight. I am just over the moon to speak to Daniel. I was one of the very fortunate few to read it quite early on, Daniel, right? You had sent it to me quite early. And so I'd read it, PDF, gloriously have the, the hard copy with all my comments and questions. What can I say? This is exactly the type of novel that first drew me magnetically to Latin American literature and beyond. It's just a brilliant work of art that threads a powerful type of heart-rending interiority, intimate and political reportage, and national history, all in a country reeling with both the material and phantasmic horrors of its past. And not only that, in its attempts to reconcile the memory in people who are both dead and alive. I mean, honestly, what more could you ask for from a work of art? It is a novel both of the Argentine and North American traditions, which means, in part, to me, that it's very metaphors, it's very stories and realities inhabit a multiplicity. I adore this novel, so I jumped at the chance to talk to Daniel about it. And, you know, just as a note to everybody, well, we're just going to have an open, great, wonderful conversation. I have questions. And more importantly, too, if you have questions or comments or anything, please feel free to type that into the chat, and I'm happy to relay them and sort of expound on those conversations. But I have to start, Daniel, with something that I thought about really throughout the entire reading. Your novel is such a fierce conversation with nationalism, history, empire, the reality flattening horror of the Cold War, and all those people trapped in between that are forgotten, or rather in this case, people who are disappeared during the Cold War and during the dictatorship of the Guerra Sucia in Argentina, up to 30,000 people. So early on, when it's revealed the protagonist, Tomás, he's a medical student in Buenos Aires, and he returns years later to Argentina and to an Argentine version of Hades. His guide, so to speak, through life and through Hades, the colonel says, I believe it's one of the oddities of the netherworld that national borders still exist. I mean, I was struck very powerfully with that. It's sort of an obsessive idea. So can you talk, Daniel, to get us started, can you talk a little bit about nationalism and Hades? Are they one and the same? Does the former lead to the latter? The colonel even says, what is Argentina after all, at some point? I'm just obsessed with this metaphor, this unreal, unstable realism that you created in which Buenos Aires and Argentina is Hades. Can you talk about that?
First of all, I just, you're making me blush a little. I wish I could talk about my book as eloquently as you can. And also, yes, many thanks to the whole Fitzerman Sturba family out in Tulsa. I wish I could be with you guys tonight and see your faces out there in person. Yeah, I think part of that was that, the hell of the story is sort of, I wanted it to be uniquely Argentine, both because I knew sort of that it would be. That is to say that it was very much a result of what had happened in Argentina specifically. But I think in a way, I want to go a step further and say, in a way, it's more that I felt that everyone's hell or their Hades, their underworld is specific to them. And Tomás goes through for him, the underworld, the Hades of Argentina is a journey through really his memories and the life he chose to lead and the choices he made or failed to make. And so for him in particular, Hades is going to be Argentine because that is sort of the place that his life forked. That is where his world shattered and changed sort of irrevocably. So for him to sort of go through the most haunting moments of his life, it's going to be Argentine. And I say that just because a lot of, on the one hand, I hope this book and the world in it is obviously very uniquely Argentine. I hope a flavor of Argentina runs through it. But on the other hand, a lot of what it deals with, I hope, is sort of universal in the sense of what happens when you're living under any kind of political oppression. And it was very common even in the rest of Latin America to have, as well, experiences like this, a lot of military dictatorships, but also even recently in January 6th, we saw sort of some of this. And so anyway, all of this to say that on the one hand, it was sort of a chance for me to have fun with what was uniquely Argentine in this terror and this experience, but on the other hand, to explore what is anyone's personal hell. It's the place that they sort of came from or lived through. And in this case, that was very for Tomás, it's Argentina. But I sort of in the back of my mind have this idea, well, for a Brazilian, would it have been a Brazilian hell?
Yeah. And I found it fascinating because there's sort of these material metaphors that take on sort of material properties in the novel. And of course the colonel keeps coming back to this idea, this attachment to the national identity and spiritualism, Catholicism. And he has his own hauntings, and he has his own lives he never got to live because of the consequences of that. And I just found it absolutely fascinating that this type of spirituality or this type of Hades has borders. It's just a fascinating idea. And you know, I kept thinking when I was reading, and you had mentioned, you know, of course we were thinking, what would the North American version of Hades be? And you had mentioned the sort of the storming of the, you know, of the petite bourgeois people on the Capitol we had in the January. And, you know, you had mentioned that, and a light bulb went off, because I'm thinking the contours of that are so Latin American. But it's also, I know, and we were able to talk previously about how it's something like the empire coming home. You know, the sort of concept of the things that are, and that's what's the universality of your novel, is when you have these systems in place throughout the entire world, they're gonna echo each other. I just thought that was just absolutely fascinating. So I want to know, this is so intricately researched. It's so not only from, you know, a geographical or sort of a metaphorical sense, but it sort of the effects of the dictatorship, right? The effects of the oppression, and the effects of how that sort of reverberated throughout the country. It's just so fascinating in research. But what do you think, why a novel? What do you think that recorded history can't do that a novel can?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was that while you know, a lot of research went into this in terms of people's experiences, and you know, reading about torture center, and which Tomás sort of winds up voluntarily working to spy there for the woman he loves, who joins the resistance and sort of convinces him to do this. And there was a lot of research even in just what the resistance looked like and all of these things. My connection to this is very personal. You know, my half sister Isabel, whom I never met, was disappeared in Argentina in 1978. She was a member of the resistance. The character of Isabel, whom Tomás falls in love with, and for whom he joins in this effort and winds up spying at this torture center, that character is inspired by this woman. And you know, my interest in this came from that. It came from my own emotional experience, the experience of my father, who felt a ton of grief and a lot of guilt over her death. It came from knowing people in Argentina, most people actually not in Argentina, people who had left for either Uruguay or other places. And my interest was in the emotional side of this. And you know, history and nonfiction can get at those things, certainly. But I felt I needed to sort of put myself in the mental shoes of the people, you know, who are still living through these tragedies, the people I knew. And Tomás in particular was, you know, my way of sort of doing that. I mean, the book begins 10 years after the main events of it. You know, he's looking back on his experiences, and that, again, that was sort of my experience of it, was with the benefit of hindsight. I don't even know if it's a benefit, hindsight, but who were looking at it with hindsight. And so anyway, I think that was one major piece of it, is just my entry point. Another entry reason is that, you know, I think in a novel form, you get to pose questions to which there are not easy answers. You know, if you're recording history, you can say someone chose X, someone chose Y, but you can't really get inside the head of someone deciding whether or not to do it. So for instance, you know, Tomás, who was asked by the woman he loves to work at a torture center to spy on the activities of the regime, such a decision, a request that was made by people, you know, at this time, to get in the head of someone actually wrestling with that, and wrestling with what is good versus evil in such a decision, what is moral versus immoral. I think only fiction can sort of allow you to force the reader, force people to ask themselves what is what they would do, what is right versus wrong for them in such a situation. And that's what I was interested in. And I can, spoiler, I as author do not know the answers in this book of what was right or what was wrong, but the writing it as a novel allowed me to wrestle with those questions.
And you wrestle them, not just the thing I found so sort of bountiful in is that you wrestle with those moral, ethical, sort of political morality, those questions, not just as a singular consequence. I think your novel does something substantially unique and very artful in that the morality of a singular decision just isn't explored in its reverberations, but you're constantly introducing this sentiment of what if, right? You're constantly, I'm very biased for the questions about what if, but you're exploring the morality of not just a singular decision, but multiple ones, and sort of exploring in part what that meant for Tomás and what that meant for the people whose lives he was entangled with during this period of time. I mean, that, when Thomas, like, for example, when Tomás turns to Buenos Aires, the country is facing this type of like reconstruction period, right? Or reconciliation to the extent possible. It had tinges of, historically what happened after the Spanish Civil War, after, when the dictator finally died in the 1970s in Chile, in post-Reconstruction, in different forms in the United States. So this is following, a dictatorship and the horrors of camps where, like, dissidents, leftists, communists, laborers, journalists, poets were tortured, and enormous amount of people were disappeared. So there's, to me, like, when I read, there's this visceral, melancholic, and actual awareness in Hades that things could have happened differently, right? Things could have happened differently for Tomás. And so this what if, this haunts him, right? This what if haunts Tomás, and especially when it comes to his thoughts about Isabel, the life that they could have had, or the life that Tomás wanted. Can you talk? I love the idea that you had said, there's, as a novelist, our hard work doesn't have answers. Like, I've always sort of like loved that about sort of fiction, and you do all the hard work and it gives you, of course, less and less answers. But not to make this easy for you, but can you talk a little bit about choice and free will and complicity in your novel, because it's so entwined in this what if, and you brilliantly splinter the moral choices that Tomás has to make, and I think you're pushing the boundaries of sort of what a novel can do when it comes to, like, how do we approach moral decisions.
Yeah, this goes a little to my background. My father, who, his grief and his guilt was, I think, focused on these questions of what if. What if I had done X, maybe Isabel would have come to New York. What if I'd done Y? I think, and then, of course, what if Isabel had done X or Y? I remember my father at one point just saying, because my half brother, Isabel's full sibling, was just a couple of years younger than her, but wasn't as involved in the movement. And someone speculated maybe that was just because she was a different grade. And she went to college at a moment where, like, the political fervor was such that she got very caught up. And anyway, you end up with this kind of event, with this kind of grief, literally unpacking every what if. And so I'd sort of grown up, or not grown up, but I had heard a lot of these what ifs. And I think, there's always a sense, or there can be a sense for people who've lived through this kind of tragedy, that if only I'd done things differently, there's so much I could have done differently. And again, I don't want to give too much away in this book, but Tomás feels that way. He thinks he could have done so many things differently. And as he sort of is taken through the underworld of his memories in this period, he learns that in some ways, a lot of these decisions that created grief in his life or the lives of others, he actually wouldn't have done differently. He finds he sort of had made moral choices. And I think, that's not 100% the case, but I think you can be tortured by everything you didn't do, but if you're actually given the opportunity to, like, relive those things and re-experience them, you might find this is like among the more optimistic things I'll ever say, but you might find that you actually made the vast majority of your decisions sort of right, or the best to the best of your ability. And I think when you grow up, when you live in the shadow of regret, which is like such a powerful feeling, it's one of my biggest fears. To me, then, I sort of think if the goal of fiction is to like evaluate the choices we make, I mean, I don't know, that's my grandiose view of what fiction can do. A character is wrestling with choices, and that's where stakes come in. That's where moral stakes and drama come in. But I think there's as much power in knowing where a character goes right as when they go wrong, and I think there's power in knowing that there's no easy answers to that question either. So
yeah, I mean, and it's so powerfully the way it's sort of it's introduced in the novel, this like mythology of choice. It's not we, and I say this as a former high school teacher, we always introduce this conceptual thing of free will versus fate, and I think to a large degree that argument is relevant because we live between that in shades, depending on variables of our life. And like you said, the choices that we sort of optimally think are going to be at the given condition and time the most moral decisions. It's absolutely heart-rendering because what that leads to is unknown, right? You don't, and then so that gives us sort of this sense of eternal regret regardless, right? Even if we know we had optimized these choices. I don't want to give anything away, but to me, in one sense, the elegance of it was, and I won't say anything about the ending, but it felt to me very Argentine, right? It felt to me that you were sort of contesting with the soul of the country and what those choices mean. And sometimes there's there's harm that is irrevocably sort of introduced generationally. In Tomás, and not to say that he would represent that by any means, but the decisions he made, going over through his life and able to sort of consider it. I think it's a deep fear we all have, right?
Deep fear, yeah.
It's a deep fear I think we all contain, inside and out with our own lives. And of course, for that to be explored to such a degree in the novel is there's a multiplicity there. Usually we read great books and usually we have this sort of contest where we're dealing with one moral choice, right? Or we're dealing with sort of a big decision or an epiphany, and it sort of follows this traditional arc. And I think you upset that in a wonderful way. You inverse sort of what happens in quote unquote traditional novels when you're dealing with sort of a moral arc.
Thanks. One phrase you mentioned there that I thought was sort of interesting, the mythology of I forget if it was free will or regret or one of these things, but it's interesting to me to think about it in that sense. Of course, the book takes a lot from mythology, the Orpheus Eurydice story, Odysseus going to the underworld, later Dante going to the underworld. And all of those stories, to a large extent, I mean, the very nature of myth is sort of these stories where often it feels like it's preordained. I mean, that's like sort of like what myth often feels like, and it's often around like a hero. You never really like think to yourself, well, like, oh, maybe Orpheus could have not looked back at Eurydice.
Yeah, he has to.
And I think, to me, maybe there was also that element, the contrast of this sort of like epic mythological space that so often is about sort of predetermination. I mean, there's religious schools that say, you're predetermined to end up somewhere in the underworld, and to write sort of about an ordinary person being confronted with this mythological terrain, and also figuring out like that nothing was preordained. The choices could have gone differently. And I don't know. Anyway, I could ramble about it.
Yeah, no.
I was a philosophy major, unfortunately.
No, this is
that's where free will questions also come from. I was obsessed in college with the idea that there has to be, right, free will. And I think in the book I'm still sort of trying to like prove that somehow and succeed.
Well, I know, like, just from studying, some science, I studied evolutionary biology in college, that wonderfully scientists grapple with the same thing. So like when you have like theoretical physicists arguing about deterministic qualities of the universe versus sort of accidental, it's like, from our inner morality of like our given choices to the stars. It's
for the record, to anyone who hasn't read the book, you do not need to know theoretical physics.
no. That's sort of my own wandering when I think about these things. But I also think what's fascinating to me is that, you know, you have at the center of that becomes a question of complicit, right? And who's complicit, and to the extent, and that's such a conversation, that's such a theoretical and a material conversation that happens post dictatorship, when to some degree societies have to reunite. I think on a tangentially, the United States is dealing with something similar, if not as horrific. I shouldn't say if not as horrifically, because there's sort of horrific events that have happened over the past few decades, but it's still this complicity in who to a point gets to reconcile what's complicit, and then also who gets to move on.
Yeah, you know, again, it's sort of the to that question of like free will a little bit, where, you know, the problems of deciding if someone's gonna, you know, a character is deciding, or a person for that matter is deciding between two choices of like good versus evil or whatever, is that not only like just the choice itself, do you do your own self-interest or the interest of the greater community, which is often sort of how it's portrayed in drama, there's also the reality that to choose to do good often has either unintended consequences or requires you to be complicit with something bad. And you know, that's the case here, where Isabel asked Tomás to work at a torture center, and he's definitely, you know, is working for the greater good, or he's trying to, but he has to every day sort of watch actual torture happen. He has to be friendly and chatty with torturers. And he loses his sense of what side of that divide he's on, even if he knows he's trying to be good. And part of this was, you know, just I think in any sort of unjust system, you know, of government, of anything, you are forced to be complicit in some way, small or large, and figuring out where those lines are. I mean, that's sort of the challenge. I think it's a challenge that we're all sort of facing with, like, as conversations around systemic racism and like that are coming up. You know, figuring out what set of choices make you complicit with the larger system in place, and you know, again, it's the nice thing about fiction is I don't have to know the answer.
Exactly.
You know, I don't know where Tomás, you know, sort of at what point the complicity is okay or not. You know, again, he sort of does what he has to do, but I guess the real point I'm trying to make is it's very easy to be complicit with bad things, even when you're trying to be good.
Correct. There's that, the shades between the choice and the shades between what is sort of like almost because of nationalism sort of forced on you.
And even like if you're just trying to, like, even, you know, I mean, Tomás's case is sort of extreme because a woman asks him that he's in love with to join the resistance, but you know, there are people at this torture center at the Motores Orleti where you know, one guy is just sort of a career man in the army. He just winds up there. He doesn't feel good about it. He you know, doesn't like what he's doing. All the other guys call him triste, which means sad, because he hates the work he's doing. But a lot of people in Argentina, and I think in general, you know, just from climbing a sort of career ladder, end up in those positions. It doesn't justify the actions they take at all, but it's I think it's so easy to fall into doing bad things, even when you're trying really hard not to. And I think, you know, that's why I was exploring complicity, to show that how easy it is to fall into those traps, so to speak.
And there's this, you know, especially in a time of dictatorship or nationalism, there is this overriding reality. It flattens reality for so many people, right? It forces decisions, it limits what you're able to publicly do and say or behave. It sort of contorts any free will, or it contorts, you know, it's interesting because there's this conversation of, we sell, for example, we sell art, we sell literature, but at the core of it, when you have these dictatorships, that's some of the first people they go for are those who are enacting a substantial amount of free will, the poets, certainly in Argentina and like Chile, the writers. And I've always found that fascinating, why poets are the first to disappear in any regime. And you can see how that could quickly unfold. We've seen that, for example, with Trump. And I always thought of it in terms of like limiting and controlling reality. The terms by which reality is controlled forces a lot of people out. I do have a question from Mark Fitzerman. And apologies if anyone hears a crying baby who's going to bed, if you hear. Mark Fitzerman, wonderful question. So on that same question of what happens afterwards, I just reread Dan's companion piece in The Atlantic and was struck again by the immediacy of the Argentine horror. It meant seeing your torturer in a coffee shop or your rapist in a dry cleaner. If Haiti's Argentina is in part about redemption and release, how does a nation release itself from its brutal history? Oh, this is a phenomenal question. Thank you, Mark. So examples: Cambodia, Rwanda, Germany. Has anyone gotten it right? What does Argentina tell us about the process? This is an extraordinary question.
Great question. I can't say if anyone's gotten it right. I can speak to Argentina, which is there has to be more accountability. I think Argentina, the one problem with Argentina is essentially the military dictatorship to some extent won. Unlike Nazi Germany, which was defeated in war, a lot of places, I think one starting difference is if a country is defeated or not. If the government in place is defeated. If they are, it's easier to sort of get accountability. In Argentina, that basically wasn't the case. It was the economy that sunk the dictatorship, not justice, really. And so very few people went to prison for a really long time, and that silence persisted, and I think that to me, it's accountability for the people who are guilty, but even beyond that, because especially knowing that like subordinates are guilty, and it's not always clear who, at what level, someone should be held accountable, what level they're just sort of doing their jobs or whatever. I think either way, the most important part is figuring out a way to end the silence, right? In Argentina, that silence persisted for a long time in various forms. Part of that was because people were still walking around that victims were afraid of. Part of that was the fact that disappearances were done, and therefore there were very few memorials for people. There were very little confrontation of the death that had taken place. So I think in different forms for different countries, just bringing things out in the open is the key, and it's never easy. Because of course, conversely, you look at places where, like, Iraq, where like the Ba'ath Party wasn't allowed to sort of stay there, and then the whole governing apparatus is gone, and the country falls apart. I think either extreme is wrong, and unfortunately, the answer probably is in finding the balance of accountability and sustaining the system in place. And that's like not really a very it's not very like idealistic answer, that you have to find like shades of gray in a solution to that problem. But I think you do, and I think it's knowing there is not going to be a single solution is part of the solution, probably.
And there's that sense of what humanities, what arts can do, is sort of that process of unsilencing. I think what you have to speak to that, how do you answer these political questions? Has anyone in the 20th century or even early 20th century gotten it right? But what has sort of transformed the way we think about it, and sort of this multiplicity, I think, is through literature, through novels, through poetry. And is that enough? I don't know, but what it does, I think, for people is it sort of unsilences and reclaims that past. And surely your novel is in that tradition, I think, and very important. Kind of leads me to, I do want to talk about the Argentine, we have time, the Argentine literary tradition. I know when we talked before, we were both sort of obsessively talking about the American and the Latin American traditions coming together. So I know previously we spoke of Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo. If no one has read Pedro Páramo, it is sort of one of those slim essential reads. It's sort of like a very good gateway to Latin American literature, I think, to begin with. And also, I thought when I was reading Ernesto Sabato, I really thought about him when I was sort of reading your novel, because he's a novelist who also presided over the commission that investigated the fate of those who disappeared. When would that ever happen in the United States? Where an acclaimed novelist would have the sort of political influence to preside over the very memory of the country, right? The investigation. If you could think of like a novelist being in charge of the 9/11 commissions, like it's an extraordinary intertwining of politics and literature in Latin America that comes across. So for me, especially his novel On Heroes and Tombs, have you ever read that one?
I haven't.
But
I have read Sabato, and I have a fondness for Sabato because actually my grandfather was a physicist in Argentina, taught Ernesto Sabato, and Ernesto Sabato studied physics because of my grandfather. And
oh shit, we need to drink all night and just talk about that too.
But
wow.
I will say your point about the fact that Ernesto Sabato led the commission on the disappearances is one that I sort of forget sometimes. And I think you're totally right about like that would never happen in the U.S. and I like even I was just thinking and hearing you speak, like there's a line in the book about, so Peronism is obviously a big political force in Argentina. And honestly, no one sort of understands anymore what Peronism means. There's a left wing of Peronism, a right wing of Peronism. No one really understands what Peronism is. And someone in the book, Isabel, says basically that Peronism is like poetry. You can't explain it, but you can recognize it. You know it when you see it. And I do sort of wonder, there's Argentina is this very like passionate country that it's extremely, emotions are always overflowing, and that's true in every sphere from politics onward. And I sort of think it's fitting that that Peronism is compared to poetry, that a writer is in charge of a political commission, that melding of the political and the like artistic and literary does feel pretty unique. And there's a reason, for instance, this character of the colonel, the mentor of Tomás in the book, who's high up in the military, is a big reader. He's sort of the most sophisticated character in the book. He's the one who's always sort of talking about, he plays chess, he drinks, he has his negative opinions about Borges and Cortázar, but he loves certain other writers. And anyway, I think, to circle back, I guess, to your question about Argentine influences, Argentine literary influences, in some ways, I would say there are fewer specific Argentine influences, I admit, on me than other writers from Latin America and then North American writers as well. But I think the obsession with literature, the unique obsession in Argentina with literature and like what it means and how it can relate to so much else is the big influence in and in the book. Like my father, when I was a kid, grew up quoting me Macbeth. It's just sort of this like, I think that literary over the topness, the word histrionic, very much obviously comes to mind for. Anyway, that's my.
No, it's like I had an opportunity some years ago to go to Buenos Aires in Argentina for like 2 months, and I was in sort of this dreamscape because while all of sort of the corner newspaper stores, corner newspaper places in Chicago were closing down, 10, 12 years ago. I went to Buenos Aires, and you had, on street corners, not only did you have newspaper stands, you had newspaper stands that sold poetry. So under sort of, the war on terror and following sort of the American headlines in these Buenos Aires newspapers, you would have poets like being sold. It was like felt like I was lost in an alternative world where it's like it made sense to me. It made that intermingling of the day's current news with sort of like this eternal, we're going to sell poetry books, and all, of course, the used bookstores, and not to romanticize it too much, because it's tied to a very specific tradition. It's tied to a lot of things that happened in the Cold War. But as a writer, just thinking about going off in the realm of like thinking about craft and art, and just as a writer, was there anything conscious happening when you were writing this novel about how to combine this Argentine tradition with sort of North American tradition, North American publishing? I feel like it's an exciting thing happening in the United States right now, where this is happening continually, not just with Latin America, but with other continents, other countries. And for me, it's a type of literature of unstable realism. All these young Latinx and all these young Latin American and North American writers developing, in my opinion, sort of like a new movement. What kind of thought process as a writer went into that, if any, as you're thinking about these two traditions kind of meeting in the middle, certainly in your novel?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, again, a lot of people always want to ask me like what Argentine writers influenced me, and
Yeah.
I'm sort of a little embarrassed at my short answers. And obviously, like Borges sort of like is a foundational writer for me, and Samantha Schweblin influenced me, but there are, in some ways, the most direct influences on the book itself, on the kind of book it is, were not we're not Argentine, may not even have been Latin American. Jesmond Ward's Sing Unburied Sing, which is a novel that explores the legacy of Jim Crow and mass incarceration using a ghost. A book very much in some ways about Mississippi. Underground Railroad, sort of another book that explores a historical tragedy through like a literalizing a kind of magical thing. And Exit West is another that definitely influences. Anyway, all this to say, after the book has come out, and people sort of want to point out how Argentine I am, and obviously it's titled Hades Argentina, so it's sort of my own fault. But it's been funny because a lot of the influences are from all over the place. A lot of people these days are down on globalism, and I think in the pandemic there's a lot of like also weird feelings about globalism in a year where there's been no international travel. But I think the beauty is that I can be influenced by a writer from Mississippi, a writer from Pakistan, and from like a long heritage of South American literature. I almost can't wait until everyone is so mixed up through immigration that we don't even know what literary traditions are anymore. It's really hard to draw lines based on nationalities. I mean, I on the one hand, tango and like the spirit of Argentina really influenced this book, but on the other hand, I don't know what literary tradition I belong to. I don't know that I want to know. I think I get to be free a little bit now to say, I'm all mixed up, and I don't know what I'm writing. I don't know which tradition I belong to. I kind of love that.
So you're an anti-sovereign leftist. I love it. But I think that's so apparent too, because in your novel too, certainly when the Colonel is sort of approaching nationalism almost cynically, right? Like, what is, like I said, it's a previously, he says, what is Argentina? And borders, I have this friend who is always edifying and always talking about how like borders and national states themselves are really young. Like, we still don't know how to contest with the fact that borders exist. 1800s, late 1700s, you have sort of the invention of the country, and with it sort of the mythology. Tango's a part of that. American football is part of that. Like, we have these these ideas or ideals we hold close to us that are like so relatively dangerously new in the mind. And I think artists, and we're always writers and artists are looking. I feel like we feel like there's a fault to that, right? If we can't name it, there's this culpable sort of interior fault to have to think that you belong to a nation or a tradition or a country. And surely I think we're still struggling with that in literature. Like I think of my, for whatever reason, I'm just so attached on the sentence level to Laszlo Krasnorka. I don't have that national tradition, right? I'm not Hungarian. I do have family from Eastern Europe, but I don't think about that when I read his sentences. For example.
People are always shocked when I name as an influence another Mississippi writer, Donna Tartt, and people are like,
"Oh yeah,
what?" I don't understand, and I'm like, I don't know. I think one thing that's also kind of funny about this is like, one of my favorite writers is growing up in high school, college was Dostoevsky. Two of my favorite living writers are Ishiguro and Donna Tartt, and I know that both were very influenced by Dostoevsky. And so what you end up is this weird thing where like people from totally different worlds, because there's now so much crossover in what literature you can read. I can read Russian literature today. I can whatever. There's so much crossover in the possibilities for influence in a way that I find really exciting. And I don't know. I hope if the question of influence gets mixed up enough and impossible enough to answer, I hope people will sort of focus more on just the works themselves. I think there's such an emphasis on, now I'm talking as an editor more as a writer, but on like who the author is, where they come from, and it can change so much about the way a book is read, and the ability of a book to stand on its own. And so I don't know. My next book will not have the name of a country in the title. That's what I'll tell you. I mean, not that this book, I love my title.
Yeah.
And it is very much about Argentina, and I'm being a huge hypocrite. But
no.
I sort of do look forward to the possibilities of the blending getting even blurrier. That's what I'll say.
Beyond sight. Like I think you brought up Dostoevsky because I just was thinking right now, Notes from Underground, sort of that idea that you can't predict human behavior, right? Like he goes on this diatribe about this machine. If we have this machine that can predict human behavior 100% of the time, I'm paraphrasing, people would go against the machine out of sheer madness and just to exert their own free will. I see that. So we're gonna I want to make sure that we have questions. If anyone has questions, I'm gonna do a quick bonus round, and I feel, Danielle, that we could talk so much longer, and we will post-vaccine. When I'm out in New York, we're gonna hang out. But I want to make sure I have a quick bonus round, and then I want to make sure if anyone has questions in attendance tonight, please feel free to just write them in the Q&A. I'm happy to relay them. And in the meantime, I'll do a quick bonus round. What writer, living or dead, best captures for you our current state of unreality?
Oh my God.
I'm thinking too much.
What writer, living or dead? God. I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of a little weirdly tempted to I don't know, I'm sort of tempted to answer Dostoevsky. Actually, I was gonna say Ishiguro, but maybe that is just because I was reading about Ishiguro yesterday.
With his new book out, yeah.
But I think he's the great writer of being sort of stuck in your own perspective. And I think that in many different ways, that's what's happening today, whether people are trapped in themselves because of the pandemic, and or because politically they're trapped in themselves. And I think he's sort of the writer of people who cannot see beyond their limited perspective. So
I love that there's sort of a dangerous interiority to that.
Yeah.
If you're trapped too much in yourself.
Yeah.
No, that's a good, and that's one of the best answers I've heard. So for me, I kept thinking just sort of as this process of for cities, we've talked a lot about countries, but there's sort of this, I have an attachment much more to cities than I do ever of any countries. I kept thinking, like, for me, Chicago, New Orleans would be my Hades nothing horrific I'd be chasing, I hope, sort of just like a quiet existentialism, reviewing life. But what city sort of like formed you? What would be your Hades, hopefully without the horror attached to it?
New York and Buenos Aires are the two cities I know best. New York is where I grew up. There are things in the book that obviously can apply to Buenos Aires and did when I was there. For instance, Tomás, as a way of sort of dealing with some of what he's going through, just walks the city streets. He just walks and sort of tries to either not think about things or think about what he's going to do. And that was true of my own experience in Buenos Aires, but I think is born out of, New York and a sort of this city, this sort of unique wandering in a city, big city, and I don't know. I mean, but those are the two cities for me. Buenos Aires, I have spent far less time in than New York, but I spent my time there largely alone, or primarily alone. Even though I had friends, it was a little more secluded an experience, and so I sort of connected with it in a different way, in a way that felt very uniquely mine. And so that's the number two answer.
I mean, I surely think in a Calvino way, cities sometimes we visit for a short time can permanently sort of alter us. They have that.
Yeah, and I think the first, every time I go back to Buenos Aires, even if it's just 2 weeks, I feel like I've lived a short little life. I think that's partly because, I mean, it's a beautiful city, and partly it's a city with a ton of contradictions, a city with a lot of life, and also a lot of pain. It sort of combines all of these things, like a lot of spiritualism, but a lot of hedonism, a lot of sadness, but a lot of like joy for life, like in the desire to eat red meat and drink red wine, sort of party till dawn, and yet there's this undercurrent of nostalgia and sadness. And so I feel like every time I go there, there's like this dose of emotion and experience that sort of is times 10 that of any other city you visit, if that makes sense.
And it inhabits you. For me, one of my most famous one of my most exciting and grateful times I had in Buenos Aires was, my family is Lithuanian, Jewish, and Ecuadorian, and I got to argue about Jewish history in Spanish with people in an old Jewish neighborhood. For me, it was just so much fun. We have a question, Nicholas. As someone who is reading Heroes and Tombs, because Mike told me I ought to, I really do adore that novel. Thanks, Nick. He's just saying you're both brilliant and this is fun. Danielle, can you speak a little bit about writing from not only such a personal place, but a deeply familial place? What has that experience been like for you? What has the discussion been like with your loved ones? Talking a lot tonight about literary tradition, but it seems the story might exist in another kind of familial, historical, or oral tradition too. This absolutely elegant question. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, great question. It's sort of complicated because for a long time, my sister wasn't really spoken about in my home. It was sort of too painful for my father. And I sort of found out about her in a very fragmentary way over the years. I had to sort of investigate her on my own. So the book wasn't born of an oral tradition in that sense, really. However, then when I did start to investigate Isabel's life, my sister's life, and I started to have conversations with my brother, with her cousins, with her partner's brother, whom I'd never met. I started to have conversations with people that I could tell they hadn't had ever, maybe, certainly not in years. They had not talked much about Isabel, about what had happened to her. And then some of those conversations were very difficult at first. My father struggled to read the book at first. My other half sister Bonnie still, I don't think, has read the book. But some of the conversations, I could see the sort of reward on the other person's face, where they finally get, a cousin of Isabel's like was just so grateful to finally be able to talk about it.
Wow.
And and then, even if at first, my father struggled to read the book, and then he did and got really engaged with it. And there's a piece of this which is, my sister was disappeared. She did not have a memorial, and so as a result of this book, of investigating this book, there was a very big familial piece of this, which was that I actually did a blood test to identify her remains, and we interred her remains finally in April of 2019, which obviously was a very long time after 1978, and a lot of people came to that memorial and finally paid homage to her in a way that had never happened before. So all of this to say, I don't think the book has closed wounds, and I don't think even the memorial ceremony has closed wounds, but I think it has given people the chance to air those wounds, to feel feelings that they had sort of really tried to cast aside. And that has been extremely rewarding. There were periods in writing this that I sort of felt like a fraud, like I was sort of pillaging my family's tragedy for a story. Even identifying her remains, the fact that I was sort of leading that effort, and I never met her, and my brother and father didn't want to revisit this question because it was hard for them. I sort of felt like a fraud there as well. But I frankly, I don't really anymore in that sense. I feel I've seen enough gratitude and people, not for me or the book, but for experiencing something that allows them to reconnect with someone who had been disappeared. And so anyway, all of this to say it's been difficult, but really rewarding in the end, just really, really rewarding.
And I think Daniel, that the book itself is a testament to that memory, that very, and this is what I said at the beginning, it's so much of a work of art because it traverses what is fiction. It in the ways that, like you said, you've affected people and family and your readers who whether they're aware of that or not, it traverses that space between reality and fiction, and that's a beautiful testament of a memory to your half sister. So I can't thank you enough for this book. Elegance, its brilliance, and its ability to sort of traverse that. So thank you.
Thank you.
We're just out of time. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, thanking everyone for these just extraordinary questions. The people who ask questions should go to all book events. They were just really quite elegant. And you can definitely, I want to make it very clear, please purchase your copy. If you can see, there's a link in the chat to Magic City Books. You can purchase your copy of Hades, Argentina. I guarantee you, if you mark up books, or if you do what I do and put those, there'll be a lot of them in there. Please do so. It's very rare, especially now when we get to experience novels that enter that space that sort of, like I said, traverses into the real. I think it's an affecting, brilliant book. So thank you, Daniel, for writing it, and for inviting me tonight to be able to speak and ask these questions with you. Very honored. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Magic City. And yeah, even if you already have my book, buy a book from Magic City. They're a great bookstore, obviously, as you guys know. And yeah, I appreciate it. And thank you again, Michael. It's really great.
Thank you, everyone.